No easy answers. The White House grapples with the ISIS threat. Lingering grief, talking through the horror of Jim Foley's public execution. Voicing concern, Pope Francis meets with a priest who pastors a tiny Catholic community in Gaza. And back to the garden. A new crop of German beer gardens springs up in the Midwest. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Friday, August 29th, 2014. Good Friday evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick, looking at your news now. The British Prime Minister warns an Islamic extremist attack on Great Britain is highly likely. That country's raised its terror threat level. Our Wyatt Goolsby's at the White House tonight covering the American response. Wyatt?
Brian, the White House does not expect that the U.S. will raise its terrorism warning level, but says at this point there are also no imminent attacks against the U.S., but they say they are keeping in close contact with their British counterparts. One of the main concerns is making sure that, at least monitoring the threat of foreign nationals who are fighting in Iraq and Syria could potentially come back home.
What we're facing in Iraq now with ISIL is a greater and deeper threat to our security than we have known before.
Today, British Prime Minister David Cameron said that the battle against the terrorist group the Islamic State, or ISIS, is not just a foreign conflict. UK authorities estimate that 500 Britons have gone into Syria and Iraq to fight with militant groups. He said the root cause of the threat is Islamist extremism. Today, the White House says they have similar concerns.
They pose a threat because they've received military training, they are now battle-hardened, and they've demonstrated a willingness to risk their lives for their cause. Those individuals, as I mentioned, have Western passports, and that does give them some freedom of movement that could allow them to come back to the West.
Meanwhile, Pentagon officials say there are some plans ready in case the White House asks for them, reassuring the public after President Obama said Thursday he didn't have a plan yet to deal with ISIS militarily in Syria.
Anybody who has any knowledge of the United States military knows that we're ready. We're ready all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that the planning process is complete or that decisions to do anything have been made. But that we are ready shouldn't be in doubt by nobody. Nobody. Our friends, our enemies, our potential adversaries.
Now, the White House has not said how long it will take to finalize a military strategy. One other note tonight on the topic of Syria, the State Department says they are still investigating and have not released an identity yet on whether a second American jihadist was killed while fighting for ISIS overseas last week. Brian.
Thank you. Wyatt Goolsby at the White House. The human toll of the conflict in Syria has a staggering new number tonight, 3 million. Now, that's the estimated number of people who have left Syria in the last 3+ years. The UN Refugee Agency announced the total today. They also say more than 1 million people have become refugees in the past year alone. According to the UN, 1 in 8 Syrians are now outside of the country. Another 6.5 million are displaced within their own country. The death toll in the civil war there stands around 190,000. Now, some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. European nations are meeting to find ways to counter Russia's involvement in Ukraine. Leaders are meeting in Italy today. They say Russia sent additional forces into Ukraine Thursday, including tanks and troops. NATO's Secretary General says President Putin must stop this aggression.
We urge Russia to cease its illegal military actions, stop its support to armed separatists, and take immediate and verifiable steps towards de-escalation of this grave crisis.
President Putin argues that Ukrainian forces have been operating in his country. He did say pro-Russian separatists should release captured Ukrainian soldiers. Battered Malaysia Airlines says it will cut 6,000 employees, about a third of its workforce. It's part of an overhaul following 2 major disasters this year. The first with its missing flight that was headed to China. The second, a jet shot down over eastern Ukraine. The Malaysian government will take control of the airline. It was in trouble even before this year's tragedies. It reported a $97 million loss last quarter and has been losing money for several years now. Senegal is reporting its first Ebola case, a sign the disease is not being contained fast enough. The World Health Organization now knows of a student from Guinea who became ill in Senegal and tested positive for the virus. The WHO says this past week has seen the highest increase of cases, more than 500, since the outbreak began. The UN Health Agency has warned that the disease could eventually infect 20,000 people. More than 1,500 have already died, mainly in West Africa. College students from affected parts of Africa could undergo extra medical screening when entering the U.S. for fall classes. As many as 10,000 students from countries with the disease will be coming here. U.S. health authorities emphasize the illness spreads through body fluids and not close proximity. Hundreds of items that belong to civil rights legend Rosa Parks have been sold to a foundation run by the son of billionaire Warren Buffett. A long legal fight between Parks' heirs and her friends led to that memorabilia being offered to the highest bidder. Howard Buffett says his foundation plans to give those items to an institute or a museum. He says they really belong to the American people. Rosa Parks died in 2005. She was 92. She became an enduring symbol of the civil rights movement with her refusal to give up her seat on a bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama in the 60s. Does your 9-to-5 day seem to be getting longer? Well, you're not alone. A new Gallup poll out today reports full-time U.S. workers put in an average of 47 hours a week. 40 hours, of course, is the widely regarded standard, but only about 4 in 10 people actually work that number of hours. About 8% of full-time employees report working less than 40 hours a week. Well, even with Congress in recess, it's been a busy week in Washington. The Obama administration is monitoring several world crises, from the Islamic State threat to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We welcome Rebecca Berg, a political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. We have some analysis for you tonight. What do you make of the president's approach to these world crises, a kind of a strategy of no strategy?
A strategy of no strategy, to use his words. He has been, in another word, cautious. You saw first these limited airstrikes, this hesitance to get any more engaged in the region than he needed to. And now finally, because the threat has escalated so much, the president has said he is looking at cobbling together a force to go in and contain ISIS further. But we don't yet know what that is going to be.
He's emphasized that what the U.S. military is doing so far is protecting American interests on the ground and maybe some humanitarian aid. At what point does he need to go to Congress to confer about military strategy going forward?
Well, with these limited airstrikes, he didn't go to Congress. He said because there was an imminent threat to a U.S. embassy in the area, so he went in and did that on his own. But now I think we're going to see President Obama go to Congress sooner rather than later. He has had his liaison to Congress in on some of these recent security meetings. So it looks like he'll be having some discussions with lawmakers when they return. Shifting
gears a little bit, Labor Day marks the beginning of the campaign season. What races will you be watching closely?
Well, in New Hampshire, we have a race that people are looking to as sort of a bellwether for whether Republicans will have a wave election in this cycle or whether they'll just pick up a few seats, maybe just enough to win back the Senate. So we have Scott Brown running as the Republican. He has been gaining on Democrat Jeanne Shaheen. So if he does pull out a win, that would be a good sign for Republicans. And in Wisconsin, we have Governor Scott Walker, who many people mention as a potential presidential candidate for Republicans. But he is actually facing a very tough re-election fight against Democrat Mary Berg. It'll be interesting to see if he can hang on in that election so he can then potentially run for president.
I want to focus on Florida for a second. There were primaries in Florida, Arizona, and Oklahoma. An interesting case where a governor, a former Republican governor, is now the Democratic nominee.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
It's a transformation unlike any you tend to see in politics.
How did
Charlie
this happen?
Crist, able to turn around from being a Republican, losing a Senate race to Marco Rubio, and then winning the Democratic nomination here in Florida. And not only winning the Democratic nomination, but he is now in a tied race with Governor Rick Scott. Rick Scott just isn't popular in Florida. He is only begrudgingly supported by many Republicans. And so that's where you see Charlie Crist able to win over the supportive Democrats who would like to see someone else in office.
Can he take that election, do you think?
It's entirely possible because Rick Scott is just not a charismatic governor who people can get behind. Charlie Crist is very friendly. He brings everyone in, and
I wonder if he would be the first governor to have served as a Republican and a Democrat. Very interesting.
He might be.
Yeah. All right, Rebecca Berg from the Examiner here in Washington. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Coming up, how immigration courts are different from the rest of the American legal system. And German beer gardens are popping up around Milwaukee, America's beer capital. On Friday, August 29th, this is EWTN News Nightly. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Well, we've seen the beast. It's the freight train notorious for carrying people from Central America across Mexico to enter the U.S. illegally. Now, Mexican federales are targeting that train, trying to stem the immigration tide. Authorities in Mexico are undertaking the largest crackdown in decades on illegal migration. The move has decreased the flow of Central Americans trying to reach the United States. It's also dramatically cut the number of child migrants and families along the perilous route. In the southern state of Chiapas, which borders Guatemala, convoys of Mexican federal police and immigration agents search and patrol tracks of the infamous freight train known as the Beast, hauling migrants from the rail cars and sending them to deportation centers. To avoid being detained, migrants hide in the woods, but that's also where the criminals lurk.
We are chased by the Mexican Federal Police, Army, immigration agents. Despite being on top of the train, we run away from them. That's why we suffer so many accidents.
Many have apparently decided not to attempt the journey through Mexico at all since news of the raids and checkpoints, combined with stepped-up efforts in the U.S. and among Central American governments, reached their communities.
200, 300, 500 migrants used to get on top here. Right now, with ongoing raids, they're not allowed to get on top anymore.
American and Mexican officials say they're noticing the same drop-off all along the route. The roundups follow U.S. requests for help from Mexico. The U.S. government released data this month showing that the number of unaccompanied children and children traveling without a parent arrested along the southwest border of the U.S. in July was roughly 13,000, half of what it had been in June. Young men like William Martinez say they're the only ones able to evade capture.
You don't feel very safe, but you have to travel that way because the road is full of migration agents. Imagine if they catch you there. They'll deport you.
Now, it's not clear how long this crackdown will continue, but meanwhile, immigration courts here in the U.S. are struggling to keep up. Cases can take up to 3 or more years before being heard. Our Jason Calvi gives us a glimpse inside those courtrooms. Jason?
Brian, one judge calls their system an alternative legal universe. Things you think you know about the court system don't always apply inside.
This is an immigration courtroom in Northern Virginia, one of dozens across the country. They hear cases to decide the fate of people who come to this country illegally and those seeking refuge. They decide if they should be allowed to stay. The immigration court judges operate under the Justice Department rather than being part of the separate judicial branch of government. They say that situation can cause problems.
A judge is supposed to be an independent and fair arbitrator. And how can we be expected to do this if we are an attorney representing the same government as one of the parties that appears before us?
The immigration courts have only about 225 immigration judges across the country to handle 375,000 cases, meaning it can take years to actually hear an assigned case. The court cases are often heard without a defense attorney present because it's not required compared to regular court cases. Bradley Jenkins represents asylum cases before these courts. It says immigrant cases can be very challenging with or without a lawyer.
These difficulties in presenting the case are compounded by the fact that you are testifying through an interpreter, the fact that in many places around the country that you are your only witness and you are presenting your story through a television screen.
The White House wants more resources for the courts and to strengthen the border. But the president said yesterday that if Congress doesn't act, he will.
That means we've got to make some administrative choices and executive choices about, for example, getting more immigration judges down there.
The president could take some action on tackling the immigration problem in the coming weeks. He had given himself an end of the summer deadline to move forward on this, but Brian, yesterday, he wasn't willing to recommit to that timetable.
Very interesting look inside those courtrooms. Thank you, Jason. Well, a priest from Gaza received a hopeful message directly from Pope Francis today. Father Jorge Hernandez is an Argentine priest who's based in Gaza. During the conflict there, he's been exchanging emails with Pope Francis. Today, the two met in person. Pope Francis told Father Hernandez to be strong. Don't lose your joy, he said. The Holy Father said Christians there have to continue to be the salt of the earth. Hernandez told EWTN News that his parish has no water or electricity right now. He knows of only 136 Catholics in that area's population of 2 million. Father Hernandez says he was struck by the Pope's attentiveness to the tiny Gaza Catholic community. Pope Francis will donate an olive tree, a symbol of peace, at a soccer match in Rome's Olympic Stadium next week. The olive tree is also the official symbol of Scholas, the organizer of Monday's event, a program the Pope launched earlier this month. Scholas combines art, sports, and technology as a force for social change across the globe. According to Scholas, events like the soccer match help encourage what the Pope calls a culture of encounter. As part of the program, people can also plant a virtual olive tree to promote peace. Well, Pope Francis's message of peace is grabbing the attention of some cartoonists. The creators behind Plim Plim the Clown give messages of good values and positive habits with each episode. Guillermo Pino, the Argentine creator, told EWTN News they highlight the importance of solidarity, being kind, and sharing. Because the Holy Father shares a similar message, the Plim Plim creators wanted to include him in an episode.
Pope Francis and the global network Scholas Occurrences invite us to plant an olive tree for peace.
This is an animation of Pope Francis accepting the offer to plant an olive tree with the clown. Plim Plim is now available in 10 different languages. A Milwaukee beer tradition that disappeared during Prohibition is being resurrected with a twist. Catherine Zeltner reports.
The German equivalent to cheers. And thanks to the Germans, beer is ingrained in Milwaukee's culture. Introduced in the mid-1800s along with beer gardens, until Prohibition shut the gathering spots down. But they are back.
I've been to Germany 5 or 6 times and been to beer gardens there. And if I closed my eyes, I could have been in a German beer garden with this one.
That's because they're nearly identical. The community seating, the canopy of trees, the drink, and the government gets some of the revenue.
We all need more revenue. None of us are getting as much as we used to, and we don't want to just pass costs on to taxpayers.
In Milwaukee County, private entities run the beer gardens, but the county parks department gets a cut of beer and food sales.
And I think we've clearly demonstrated that this is a family-friendly community place and that it's not a place of drunken debauchery.
Beer garden operators had to overcome initial reservations. Alcohol in parks has always been a touchy subject. Now revenue is flowing. The county is expected to make more than $500,000 from the 3 permanent beer gardens and the 1 traveling gardens since the first opened in 2012. The National Recreation and Parks Association expects more private-public partnerships in the future.
I've lived around here my whole life, and I've been to Esbrook Park, but this has really drawn me to coming out and enjoying the setting and my neighbors.
Helping to create a new summertime tradition with deep ties to the past. Catherine Seltzner, EWTN News Nightly.
Up next, James Foley's faith and courage inspires, but his shocking public execution evokes grief. We talk through it. And staying safe on an urban campus. There's an app for that. Thank you for joining us on this Friday evening. I'm Brian Patrick on EWTN News Nightly, and California may be the first state to tighten the definition of consent in cases of campus sexual assault. The California Senate has passed a bill requiring an affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity as the new standard for judges to determine consent. Now, in the past, courts have asked whether victims of sexual assault had protested, resisted, or said no. The bill says lack of resistance is not consent, and it says you can't give consent if you're drunk, unconscious, or asleep. But lawmakers say consent can be nonverbal. Critics say the bill is an overreach by state legislators. It would apply to all California post-secondary schools that receive state money. It now goes to Governor Jerry Brown, who hasn't said yet if he will sign it. Well, college sexual assault is not just an issue in California. Our Catherine Elliott reports on a new mobile app to help report and prevent possible threats on campus.
At a school like Georgetown University, academics are always top of mind. But on an urban campus, student body president Trevor Tizell says there's another priority as well.
I think students are always aware of campus safety. They understand that we're living in a city and that entails certain things.
This fall, Georgetown will start using an app called Live Safe, which allows students to report on-campus emergencies with the tap of a smartphone, an act with which they're fairly comfortable.
And they're really nervous about a situation, but they can't really tell what to do, and it doesn't feel worthy of calling the police. And so what the app has done is it's really lowered barriers to sharing.
Live Safe is just one of several campus security apps utilizing a generation's fast adoption of mobile technology. CEO Jenny Abramson says there's a crowdsourcing element too, helping fellow students steer clear of potentially dicey situations.
We find that people are willing to send in information, put it on a map, and help each other be safer, both user to user and then user to group. And really our goal is to do both.
Other apps used by colleges include Emergency, which lets users pre-select a contact list, share a GPS location, and stream video of potential incidents, among other functions, and Rave Guardian, which also features a panic button for communication with campus police.
I think what this does is recognize the changing nature of how we interact with each other and addresses the safety component of that.
Making students more active participants in safety with a device they always have on hand. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally tonight, he was slain at the hands of Islamic militants. He journaled about praying the rosary. Was Global Post journalist James Foley a martyr? That's a question that's been raised since his death, even as his family mourns. Catholic teaching says a martyr is one whose witness to Christ costs their life. Wyatt Goolsby recently spoke with the bishop of Foley's family diocese, who stopped just short of calling Jim Foley a martyr. Listen.
You know, in our church, we must come together to speak of these facts, not out of emotion, but out of real truth and examination. And if truth and examination is to hold forth, it would be a wonderful thing.
And we're joined by Maureen Ferguson from the Catholic Association, as well as Amanda Baker, a crisis specialist team lead for Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington. Maureen, is it a stretch to call James Foley a martyr at this point?
Well, you know, the church has a very specific definition of martyrdom, if you want to talk about martyrdom with a capital M. So we don't know all the details of what happened in this tragedy, but here's what we do know about James Foley. He was a heroic man of faith. Of course, we've all heard the stories by now of him praying the rosary in captivity with his, fellow captives, counting out the Hail Marys on his knuckles. A huge believer in the power of prayer. We know that he had heroic courage. He was, of course, imprisoned in Libya, released, came home, didn't have to go back, but in a display of incredible self-sacrificial love, really, and great courage, went back into a war zone in Syria in order to report on the suffering of the people there, and that, of course, is what ultimately led to his death. So, and we know, too, the Pope was so moved by the story of James Foley that he called his parents, and apparently in that conversation he referred to James Foley as a martyr. So, if it's good enough for the Pope, it's good enough for me.
Amanda, what is that family going through right now?
I have no idea what they're going through personally, but I mean, I'm sure they're going through very just hard grief and loss right now. There's no way to know what they're going through privately, but publicly they're going and setting up foundations and scholarship funds at Marquette and different things where people can give money, and so they're really being almost altruistic with their grief.
Their faith seems to be helping them through it.
Exactly.
So the whole country really is grieving this. I know when I saw that image of him just before he was slain and knew that he had prayed the rosary before, I was sure in my heart he was praying the rosary. So how does faith help us get through something like this, whether it was him or his family?
I think faith can either shape the way you grieve, or grief can shape your faith. And I think the Foley family is doing, at least publicly, a great job of showing that their faith is shaping their grief, and they really have a strong foundation to fall back on, and they are very public about it as well.
Amanda and Maureen, thank you for sharing with us tonight. And thank you for watching, and we're back with a Labor Day special on Monday. Have a good Labor Day weekend for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. Good night and God bless you.